All right, so I got pretty excited about this topic. I don't know why, but got pretty excited. So I did not see when the recording ended. Hopefully, I'm picking back up and at least reviewing what we just covered. Sorry, I forgot what I exactly covered as well, because whenever I do the screen recording, I have to upload it directly. So it takes me like 10 or 15 minutes to upload. And so, yeah, jumping right back in. But all right, Raymond Cattell, what you need to take from his theory is, in large part, he was the first to look to try to measure personality theories. He did so by creating the 16PF, and the 16PF was a way to try and measure 16 personality factors, right? So moving on then, Costa McCrae ended up creating the Big Five model of personality, as I stated already, or maybe not if you didn't hear it. Costa McCrae looked at Raymond Cattell's theory and said, that's awesome. Measuring personality traits and putting them on a spectrum is really, really good and really important, but 16 factors is way too much. You can't effectively gather information on 16 factors. And so they boiled down personality to simply 5. So that's why this is called the 5-factor model, or Big Five model of personality. Now, I'll be honest, I don't call it this. You'll see very quickly what I call it, this theory of personality, as I go through each of the 5 personality dimensions according to Costa McCrae. So the first dimension is simply, let me get my little finger here because I'm having fun with this. The first one is openness to experience. So this is where the individual is creative, they have wide interests. If they're way on that side of this dimension, and if a person is very closed off, they're not interested in kind of a wide array of interests. If they have one lane and they stay in it, then they have a small amount or small number for openness to experience. And what we need to realize is, very literally, Costa McCrae's theory puts each of these dimensions right here, puts each of these dimensions on a spectrum, right? So an individual for openness to experience might be right in the middle, if you will. They also might be incredibly closed off. They might not want kind of wide-ranging interests. They might not be creative. They might not be any of that. Or they could be on the other end of the spectrum. They could be incredibly open to new experiences, and they could be very open and creative and expressionful. They might be that. Or, honestly, according to Costa McCrae's theory, they might be anywhere on the spectrum depending upon the test that they take. And the test that you have the opportunity to take, I uploaded this as Schoology, you can figure out where you lie on openness to experience, right? The next 4 include conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is where, if they're on this side of the spectrum, the person is very efficient, they're organized, they're dependable, they're ethical. On the opposite side of the spectrum, if they're more over here, if you will, this is where an individual isn't. They're not efficient, they are terrible at showing up places on time. That is conscientiousness. Extroversion is pretty straightforward. This is where an individual, if they're on this side of the spectrum, they're incredibly active, gregarious, they're willing to have conversations with people they don't know. And then, of course, the opposite side of that is introversion, right? That's easy. Agreeableness is the next one, and some of you are figuring out as I underline each of these first letters. But agreeableness is where the person is on this side of the spectrum. They are appreciative, they're compassionate, they're considerate, they're forgiving for slights. Whereas over here, and some of you might know these people, they're simply not. They're not warm, they're not forgiving, they're not generous. And again, you know these people, right? And lastly, there is neuroticism, right? Remember, these are spectrums, right? But if an individual is on this side of the neuroticism spectrum, that's where the person is anxious and self-pitying and tense. Whereas if the person is over here, they're stable, they are not anxious at all. That's where they might be. So, as you can see, the Big Five personality theory is also called OCEAN. That is simply ocean. Sometimes it is called, by me or by others, the ocean theory, right? Ocean just simply talks about openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism as personality traits that can be measured. Remember, they are dimensions, once again, that you might fall on a spectrum for each of the 5 according to Costa McCrae. So that is that. Continuing on, maybe, yes, here we go. Why is the Big 5-factor theory important? It was considered an incredibly important breakthrough in trait theory. The ability to measure 5 factors and to place people on a spectrum, hugely important to psychological history. What we see is that there's a lot of different versions found in many different cultures. So these Big 5 factors tend to apply almost universally. There's very strong indication that they are universal, but it's not perfect. And then what also is really important is when an individual has their friends complete a peer inventory for their personality, it tends to be very similar to an individual's personal inventory, right? So let's say I take the ocean test, and then I have a good friend of mine, or maybe even my wife, take the ocean test for me and trying to describe my personality. These two are pretty similar in terms of the results. So that is pretty interesting. All right, that is Costa and McCrae. Moving on then, we do have the theory of Hans Eysenck. Hans Eysenck looked at Costa McCrae's theory, and he is a little bit more modern. But he looked at Costa McCrae's theory and said, all of those are very good, but he believed that even the big five were too many. And he looked at a little bit more an individual's central nervous system. So Hans Eysenck, for sure, is much more of an individual who looks at personality from a biological standpoint. He believes that simply you are going to have the personality based upon your nervous system. And if your nervous system is wound tight, if you will, quote unquote, or is very sensitive, you might be on one end of a spectrum or another of two of his dimensions, right? And so that's an important factor here. Hans Eysenck is all about the biological approach, and especially your central nervous system and how it impacts you, right? So his two dimensions are simply introversion versus extroversion, right? So once again, it is a spectrum. An individual can be either introverted over here or extroverted over here, or they might be anywhere on the spectrum that you might find. Okay. The same thing can be true for emotionality versus stability. An individual can be anywhere on this. So obviously introversion, introversion with reserved versus extroversion of outgoing, emotionality being relaxed, emotionality being anxious, and stability being relaxed. The individual will be somewhere on the spectrum for each of these two dimensions, and it's going to be based upon their central nervous system sensitivity that places them on them. All right. And so that obviously makes your personality very kind of genetic. It's going to be in large part kind of what you were born with that is going to create you being one of the two extremes of these two dimensions. So that is Hans Eysenck. As stated already, there is a Hans Eysenck and an ocean test on Schoology for you to take to get more of an idea as to where you fall on each of these spectrums. So, all right, I already talked about this. Yes. I think good connection, good review. So again, Hans Eysenck's theory comes from a biological perspective. These traits are going to come from specifically inherited differences in our nervous system, our central nervous system. And so I think this is an important review from a previous chapter, specifically motivation. That looks pretty ugly. Sorry, guys. Eraser. Okay. And so when you take a look at this, the statement from Hans Eysenck is that if an individual inherits a system, a central nervous system that operates and tends to operate below optimal level of arousal, especially from that theory, then the person is going to constantly be trying to raise that level of arousal. And so they'll kind of be extroverted, they'll be fairly insensitive to stress, so they'll be stable, right? So remember optimal arousal theory. Let me see if I can draw this with this silly thing. I love a pen, but I don't have one. I can't do that there. Okay, let's find it here. So remember optimal arousal theory, it's almost this RPM meter that we all have. If I inherit a system that I'm constantly below my optimal level of arousal, which might be set here, this is terrible, sorry guys. But if I'm constantly over here, I want to raise that level of arousal. And so because of that, I'm going to seek out conversations. I'm going to go talk to people I might not normally. I'll also be more stable in terms of my emotionality. Right? Now, if I inherit a central nervous system that lies above optimal level of arousal, I'm constantly going to want to drive that level of arousal down, and so I'm going to be very introverted, and I'll be highly emotional, right? All right, so that is a fail. I promise I'll stop drawing with this silly thing, because that's terrible. Erase, erase, erase. All right, moving on. Okay, so that's Hans Eysenck. Now, the last one here, and I'm going to talk about this just very, very quickly. Last one here is Jeffrey Gray's approach inhibition theory. Right? He agreed with Hans Eysenck on the idea of true traits, but he thought there's a different biological aspect that caused the differences in the spectrum for people. He believed it wasn't your central nervous system. Instead, he believed that there's actually this biological system within all of us that causes us to be different. And so he called this the Bass and the Biss system, right? He called the behavioral approach system our GO system, right? So individuals who are extroverted have a very sensitive BAS, right? Conversely, the BIS is the stop system, right? This is responsible for how fearful or inhibited a person might be. And then what he believed is that introverts have a very sensitive BIS, or behavioral inhibition system. Okay? In large part, this one seems confusing. It's really not. Honestly, take from this the idea that Jeffrey Gray likes Eysenck's theory. Instead of the central nervous system, though, creating who we are, it is going to be the BAS and the BIS system. Right? Individuals that are extroverted have a very sensitive GO system. Individuals that are introverted have a very sensitive STOP system. Right? So that is that. And I lied. I'm sorry. I used the pen again. My fault. Okay. Quick evaluation of trait theory, since I have 5 minutes left on this recording. In terms of an evaluation, obviously this is really good and much different than psychodynamic theory, right? The idea of the unconscious and trying to figure out who we are as a personality based upon things we can't measure, it's very hard. This allows us to measure human personality, right? It's very good at, though, describing people, but the question of why tends to be harder, especially with Costa-McCrae's ocean theory. You can't really tell why I might be extroverted versus introverted. You can't really tell why I might be neurotic rather than stable. It doesn't really tell me why, right? Obviously, the trait approach is going to beg the question of kind of how are my traits related to the thoughts and the feelings that are going to precede the behavior or the illustration of my personality. How do we know that? And honestly, we kind of don't. And it also really kind of fails to figure out how kind of traits are going to combine in order to create a very unique person. And this is the reality is there's some limitations to trait approach. But I will bet that most of you, if not all of you, look at trait approach as a little bit more understandable than psychodynamic theory, and we'll all tip our hats to that and say that's a good thing. So, quick review over everything that we discussed today. Let's go ahead and discard those annotations because those are terrible. When looking at all the trait theory idea, the 3 assumptions, once again, traits are relatively stable, pretty predictable over time, also across situations, and people are going to be different based upon how much of a trait they possess, right? We talked about Hippocrates, which isn't all that important, but you should understand it. Remember Gordon Allport, central, secondary, and cardinal traits. We talked about Raymond Cattell, first to measure personality in the 16 PF. Costa-McCrae created the ocean test, which is important for us to know. Hans Eysenck said it's biological in order to figure out our personality traits, so introversion, extroversion, emotionality, stability. And then, of course, Jeffrey Gray with the BAS and BIS system. So that then is that. Well, what I will encourage you to do then is go on to eLearning right now and go to the ocean test and the Eysenck personality test and figure out, according to trait theory, what your personality actually is like. I encourage you to do that as a little bit of a review. No homework assignment today or anything like that, other than just making sure you understand this. And of course, if you don't, please get in contact with me. If you don't know it by now, my email address is simply here. Make sure you get in contact with me. If you need anything, please do. Obviously, I'm doing this for you guys. I want you guys to be successful. So if you got anything, if you can't hear something on this or it doesn't work, let me know, please. So I do hope all of you have a fantastic night. Be safe. Let's get through this tough time. Let's do it.